If you cannot achieve equality of performance among people born to the same parents and raised under the same roof, how realistic is it to expect to achieve it across broader and deeper social divisions? Economist Thomas Sowell. All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Thank you so much. And I do want to apologize. I know I tried to get this show at 7. Unfortunately, this morning, I just was unable to get all of my show prep done in time. And believe you me, I was up at like just after 5 a.m. It just ended up being a little bit more than I could accomplish in the morning. So again, apologize for being late, but we're going to dive right into this and see what in the world is going on with the Krassenstein brothers. All right. So yesterday, let's see, who are we starting off with there? Because there's two of them, right? And they're twins. And let's go start with Ed Krassenstein. And let's pull up something that he said yesterday. And we'll see what comes of this. So here is, let's see here, which one? This one. This is where we want to go. So he said, let's transition, get our transition there. All right. He shows this graphic here, and he shows that it says America's racial wealth gap, and then it shows the net worth of a black family is $17,150 compared to the net worth of a white family at $171,000. And then he says, well, how do you explain this if it has nothing to do with systemic racism, right? It's an interesting question that he poses, right? Like, how do you explain it? Well, what I find interesting about this question, first and foremost, is questions like this do a great deal to kind of plant a seed of something in somebody's mind. So it's kind of like what I would think of as rhetoric that allows you to say something without being held accountable for it, right? And and I think that's what he's doing here. This is why I consider this to be race baiting. But the question still remains. I mean, if these numbers are true, which I'm going to assume they are. I did not spend time looking up these particular numbers. And I know somebody had asked me, they said, well, what do these numbers represent? I assume that they're either an average or a median. Okay. So I'm not really sure which one they are, but I'm sure that if we look it up, we will find numbers that are similar to this. And so then the assumption, of course, is that, well, since there's a gap, it must be systemic racism, or maybe it's something else. So let's take a look at, two of the economists that I love, my two favorite economists, Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell. Now, let's get something clear here right off the cuff, right? Let's clear something up. They're black, and that has nothing to do with why I chose to present them. The fact of the matter is, they're very, very intelligent, both of them. And I have learned a great deal from both of them. And it's funny because whenever I do bring up some of their information, a lot of people will say, "Oh, you're just choosing a black guy that agrees with you," and and they accuse me of maybe being racist. So here's the fun part: it's actually the other way around. Because to assume that I went out and found an educated black man that says what I want him to say versus assuming that an educated black man was responsible for my instruction, right? I've read a number of books and articles and watched videos of both of these men. They're extremely intelligent and they have influenced me a great deal. In fact, they, along with others, have actually caused my own mind to change. So if you're ever presenting information, because these are economists, okay? Like these are the things that they do. They study gaps in wealth and income. They study this information. And these two men in particular have very long careers. They have done so for decades, decades, they have, they have studied this information, went out, they've been on television shows, they've debated, they've written books, they've written articles, they've put this information out there and they put it out there with the data. So we're not just, this isn't like we're just picking a couple black guys that, that agreed with us and they seem kind of smart and maybe they show a little data. No, these men have studied this for decades and they have put themselves out there in writing, in print, and in video for decades. Okay. So now remember that. Remember that the next time somebody accuses you of doing, say, hey, what, you don't think that a black man can instruct me? Like, is that what you're saying here? You're saying that these two men who have very long um, credited careers, they couldn't be responsible for me becoming a little bit wiser. Is that what you're saying? And flip the table back. Now, why would I do that? Because people do it all the time. And if that's the game they want to play, fine, we'll play that game. But let's move on. Let's get into this. What was it that Walter Williams said? And I'll post a link to the article in the show notes. And we've got a few clips here, or a few snippets here of his article. So let's see what we've got. It says, at the root of most of the problems Black people face is the breakdown of the family structure. Slightly over 70% of Black children are raised in female-headed households. According to statistics about fatherless homes, 90% of homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. 71% of pregnant teenagers lack a father figure. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. That's a very important one to remember in this particular context. And 70% of juveniles in state operated institutions have no father. Also, another good statistic to remember. Furthermore, fatherless boys and girls are twice as likely to drop out of high school and twice as likely to end in jail. I got that. There we go. So, end up in jail. So think about this for a moment. We want to know why there's a difference in the net worth of a black family versus a white family. We just point out here from Walter Williams that 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes, and 70% of juvenile state operated institutions have no father, right? So fatherlessness seems to be a big deal. All right. Well, let's see what else he says. One might say, Williams, one cannot ignore the legacy of slavery and the gross racism and denial of civil rights in yesteryear. Let's look at whether Black fatherless homes are a result of a legacy of slavery and racial discrimination. In the late 1800s, depending on the city, 70 to 80% of Black households were two parent. 70 to 80% of Black homes were two parent homes. Dr. Thomas Sowell has argued the Black family, which had survived centuries of slavery and discrimination, began rapidly disintegrating in the liberal welfare state that subsidized unwed pregnancy and changed welfare from an emergency rescue to a way of life. Okay, so what he's saying is like, hey, we've moved this safety net from being, hey, we're gonna keep you from totally crashing and burning to, you know what? Now it's more of a standard thing. All right, one last little clip here. As late as 1950, only 18% of Black households were single parent. From 1890 to 1940, a slightly higher percentage of Black adults had married than white adults. 1938, Black illegitimacy was about 11% instead of today's 75%. In 1925, 85% of Black households in New York City were two parent. Today, the Black family is a mere shadow of the past. So, what is he saying here? Walter Williams, and he's citing Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's pointing out that the family is entirely different from what it used to be. So I got another picture here real quick. We're going to show this graph here. I want to show you something. Let's see, here we go. It says percent of children living in two-parent homes by race ethnicity. Now, remember, we were just looking at a graph that said, hey, why is the net worth of a black family at $17,000 where the net worth of a white family is at $171,000, right? Presumably, again, those numbers are correct. Well, if we look here at this chart, we see that since the 1970s onward up to 2021, we can see that two parent black homes lagged behind further down than two parent white homes. Okay. And there's this, I mean, like, there's a huge gap there. You got 90% in the 1970s for the two parent white homes, which drops down to just over 70%. And then you're lingering at about 60% in 1970 for the two parent black homes, which goes down to somewhere around 40% in 2021. Now, I want you to remember, what did Williams just say a moment ago? We said where'd it go here? 70 to 80 in the late 1800s, depending on the city, 70 to 80% of black households were two parent homes. In 1800s, right? Now, arguably, that's not me. I don't even think there's much of an argument you had here, but arguably, 1800s was a worse time for racism than is today. So 70 to 80% of households were 2%. And then we get down to today and we see that as of 2021, it's down to like 40%. 40%, a 30-point drop. So, to answer Ed Krassenstein, how do you explain this if it has nothing to do with systemic racism? I don't know. How about the breakdown of the family? That seems to be important, right? We looked at, I mean, we just saw statistics about fatherless homes and all of the things that come along with it. Let's look at that again. 71% of pregnant teenagers lack a father figure. Does does getting pregnant early on, does that lead to wealth? Not to my knowledge. Let's see what else. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. That certainly doesn't lead to wealth. 71% of high school dropouts are from fatherless homes. How many high school dropouts have you heard about that become wealthy, that have a net worth of 100,000 or more? Very, very few. And the few that you see are likely to be back in the older days, right? Like back when maybe you could leave and work on the farm and build something up, but today it's almost impossible to become wealthy if you don't graduate high school. 70% of juveniles in state operated institutions have no father, right? So if you don't have a dad, then your outcome in life deteriorates rapidly. And then if, as Williams says, where do we go here? If we go from illegitimacy rates of 11% to 75%, if we go from 18% of black households were single parent to now, what was it, 60% in the chart that we just saw? 60%. So 18% were single parent. Then we cut over here and we look at 2021 and we see that 60% are single parent homes. More single parent homes than there are two parent homes. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that the family unit, the breakdown of the family unit is a huge factor. The fact that Ed, and I believe, if I'm correct, that Ed and his brother Brian, I believe they studied economics, so they should know this information. So why is he posing this question? Like, how do you explain it if it has nothing to do with systemic racism? Because he's trying to gin up race baiting issues. He's trying to just stir up trouble. He's not like, is he so like, does he really not know the answer? Come on. Like, really? Of course he knows the answer, or he has knowledge of where that answer lies. He may not know the answer, or he may have misinterpreted some of the data, but he is not a fool. He doesn't need to ask this question. He is simply stirring up trouble. Now, his brother, Brian, does much the same thing. So, in a different tweet, let's pull that one up here. Let's see where, we want this one. All right. Here we go. He said, "Holy crap, this is sad. How is this not racism on full display?" Mind you, these tweets were in the same day, just a few hours apart. So I feel like it was probably pretty coordinated. Am I missing something? Yes, Brian, you are. According to data from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the largest credit union in the United States, Navy Federal, approved a higher percentage of applications from white borrowers making less than 62,000 a year than it did black borrowers making 140K or more. Then he goes on. He says CNN found that black applicants to Navy Federal were more than twice as likely to be denied as white applicants, even when more than a dozen different variables, including income, debt to income ratio, property value, down payment percentage, and neighborhood characteristics, were the same. And then further, I know the same people will now attack me for even bringing this up. But if you are the ones being discriminated against here, I think you would be angry, wouldn't you? So again, he starts off with this question like, how is this not racism on full display? Am I missing something? Well, yes. Let's take a look. But before we do that, let's watch a clip here because I want to get a little bit more context. So CNN did this. What they did was they did this report. And in this report, they um, they pulled information from from the lenders, and they put out all this information. And by the way, just so we get that, I want to get this graphic in here really quickly. So let's there we go. Sorry about that. So this is the graphic that he used, right? And you can see that white folk are on the top, then you have Asian, then you have Native American, then you have Latino, then you have Black. So you have 77% rates of approval for the whites, whereas you have 48% approval for Blacks. And the disparity, 77 versus 48, was the largest between Navy Federal Credit and others. Okay, so just want to make sure that we get everything in here so that we're trying to give what I want to do is I want to give the best context possible so that when I criticize them, it doesn't come across as me being a little bit shady and leaving something out. So again, let's go back to I want to play this clip. And this clip comes from a local org, News for Jacks here in Jacksonville. And it's their reporting of a larger article, but it was actually a little bit shorter. So I decided to use it. And I think it really sums up everything pretty well. So let's play this and listen in.
It's one of our most read stories on news4jax.com. A recent analysis found Navy Federal Credit Union had major discrepancies between the approval rates of loans to white or black applicants. The investigation found America's largest credit union rejected more than half the applications filed by black members looking for a conventional mortgage. White applicants were approved more than 75% of the time. According to analysis by CNN, Navy Federal Credit Union only approved 48% of black mortgage applicants last year. White borrowers were approved 77% of the time. That gap is the highest among the top 50 mortgage lenders. Data also shows Navy Federal was more than twice as likely to deny black mortgage applicants than white ones, even when different variables were the same. For instance, the same income, debt, property value, or down payment percentage.
I feel validated at one point, but also I feel a bit of anger because it shouldn't be happening.
Bob Otandi is one of the report's examples. He's a Texas entrepreneur who immigrated from Kenya. Otandi told reporter Renee Marsh Navy Federal was his first choice for a mortgage. The credit union is the largest in the nation, serving military members, veterans and their families, and defense personnel.
I was the CEO of my company, so I had a pretty good income.
Your credit was in the 700s.
Mm-hmm.
You'd recently sold your house.
Mm-hmm.
You had $100,000 for the down payment, which was more than 20%.
Correct. I mean, what more could you ask for?
Otandi had a pre-approval from Navy Fed, then was rejected in a letter that listed excessive obligations in relation to income as the reason.
When they denied is when we came back and said, oh man, there's something else going on.
And what did you think that something else was?
Discrimination.
Lisa Rice is a fair housing advocate who says the analysis may not prove discrimination, but the dramatic racial disparities are stunning and disappointing.
The black-white homeownership gap and the Latino-white homeownership gap today are both wider than they were in 1968 when we passed the Federal Fair Housing Act.
We got the house, thank God, and we moved on. But what about the ones who are denied? What about the ones who now can't get their own dream house? It's something that's going to affect the generation all the way down to their kids.
After Otandi's application was rejected by Navy Federal, another bank approved him within 2 weeks. Navy Federal has faced legal action in the past concerning lending practices. The credit union paid more than $28 million in fines. And we reached out to Navy Federal for comment, and they sent us a statement tonight that reads in part, Navy Federal Credit Union is committed to equal and equitable lending practices and strict adherence to all fair lending laws. CNN's recent analysis of mortgage lending data does not accurately reflect our practices. And furthermore, their mortgage data model does not account for major criteria required by any financial institution to approve a mortgage loan. As a not-for-profit, member-centric membership organization, we are focused on expanding awareness and access to home ownership across the country. We are proud of the fact that we provide a higher percentage of mortgage loans to Black applicants than the vast majority of the top 50 mortgage originators nationwide. We posted the complete statement from Navy Federal Credit Union on newsforjax.com.
All right. There we go. All right. So that's a nice rundown of what's going on. CNN has a longer article for which you can read. Now, again, we're looking at Brian where he's like, well, how is this not racism on full display? And I'm charging him with being disingenuous in the first place. He's asking a question. He's just ginning up controversy. And I don't think that he's actually doing any evaluation or any looking at the data. And I found it interesting because if you look at the graph that he posted, right, it kind of looks bad. I mean, let's not beat around the bush with this, right? It does kind of look bad because one might expect that the rates would be closer, right? Maybe because why else wouldn't it? I mean, let's ask that question in fairness. Like, why wouldn't they? Well, according to Navy Federal, they said, hey, look, this is not even all the criteria that's being used. And then, according to the woman in the news story, she even said, hey, this may not prove discrimination. So right now, you have the Krassenstein brothers, asking this question, like, if it's not racism, what else could it be? But even the story by CNN points out that, you know what, maybe it isn't actually discrimination. Maybe they're not just looking and saying, oh, Black person, let's not give them a loan. Because ultimately, what is it that a bank is saying when they don't give you a loan? Because what are they doing when they give you a loan? They are engaging in a transaction where they intend to make money. And if they don't give you a loan, then the most obvious would be that they don't believe they can make money off of you. Now, that doesn't mean they're always right. And that doesn't mean that there aren't lenders out there that maybe, get a little snotty, and there's nothing here to say that no racism is going on. But the question of whether there's systemic racism, in other words, it's embedded into the system. Is that true? Well, maybe not so much. So I want to play another clip. And this clip is a little bit longer. It's 6 minutes. And I tried this is part of why I was late this morning. I really tried to whittle it down to the fewest amount of minutes, time possible so that you could listen to it or watch it and be well informed. So this is of Walter Williams, and this is a very old clip. And the reason I picked an old clip is because Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell have been talking about this issue for decades. I think they've been talking about it longer than I've been alive. Okay. I think they've been researching it and they keep coming to the same conclusion year after year, decade after decade. But this is a bit older one. Why I love both Williams and Sowell. I don't think this is the most exciting clip. That's why I was trying to limit it. But I don't think this is the most exciting clip, but it is instructive. So we're going to play it, and I'll try to stop and maybe just add some commentary to kind of help break it up a little bit because I think it's a little on the dry side. But we're going to play it, and we're going to see what Walter Williams says, and then we're going to look at some other charts because I think there's some things to learn, and we can answer this question about systemic racism from CNN's own charts. We're going to get to that in just a moment. So right now, let's pull up Walter Williams.
The most central premise of the civil rights vision all around the world, I believe, is that statistical disparities in incomes or occupations or education are moral injustices caused by society. That is.
All right. So I want to pause it right here, and I want to point out something. So this video is, it's back in what, 1986? Yeah, it's back in 1986. So this is very old. Like I was just a wee little lad, running around, playing and totally oblivious to any of this kind of stuff. And he's talking about these disparities. Okay. And one of the things that both Williams and Soul have pointed out, they said, it seems like when people want to talk about this stuff, everything starts in the 1970s, and you never see anything prior to that. And if you notice the where did that clip go? Where is it here? Let's go over to it. So if you notice this chart here that I found, this just a quick grab, starts in 1970, and that's part of Soul's criticism is that
The most central.
so that's part of Soul's criticism is that a lot of information can be acquired prior to 1970, but it's not, because if you start in 1970, then according to him, there's a narrative to be painted. And so this is why earlier I was reading some of the statistics that showed like, hey, in the 1800s, in the 1940s, 1920s, so on and so forth, we see a very different reality. So now, that's kind of where they're going when they talk about this stuff. But let's continue listening because this is again 1986, and Dr. Williams is talking about disparity. So let's hear what he has to say.
The premise of the civil rights vision all around the world, I believe, is that statistical disparities in incomes or occupations or education are moral injustices caused by society. That is, these statistical disparities show that, in many people's opinion, that women are discriminated against because while women are 50% of the population, they are X percent of some job. Or while blacks are X percent of the population, they're only X minus 1% of some jobs. Now, underlying this premise that statistical disparities are moral injustices caused by society, there's the assumption that discrimination leads to adverse effects on the achievement of those discriminated against. That's one of the minor assumptions. The most central.
I apologize.
One of the minor assumptions behind the statistical disparity premise. Another minor assumption is that statistical disparities or the statistical differences imply or measure discrimination by race or sex.
So I think this is a good point. And when people point out and they say, hey, look, here's this disparity, it must mean there's racism, right? What Dr. Williams is saying right here is like, there's this assumption that the outcome measures something else. But the problem with that is when people present information, data disparities, as if it measures something, they never tell you how it's measured and why we should use that as a measurement. They just kind of leave it to your imagination. This is why I titled the show the Krassenstein race baiting, right? Because they're not actually telling you anything for which we can agree or disagree with. They're not coming to you and saying, all right, look, I've seen this, and here's this disparity, and this disparity means this, and here is why. They're not saying that. Instead, they're being more insidious, and they're saying, well, what else could it be? Right. So they're planting a seed of doubt in the minds of people, and they're effectively using rhetoric to claim that it's racism without having to be held accountable for what they're saying. This is why it's a problem. All right, let's continue on.
And this assumption depends upon a third, and that is in a critical assumption to the civil rights vision that statistical disparities would not arise and persist without moral injustices being imposed by the society.
So what he's saying here is, this is kind of answering the question, like, what else could it be? And he's like, hey, there's an assumption that this is the cause of it. This is what would happen. And he's saying, he's kind of hinting, he's like, well, it could be something else.
Let me look at some of the some things, or let me just throw out some observations of statistical disparities, and I would like for you to think whether they were caused by discrimination. First, 50% of Mexican Americans marry in their teens, while only 10% of Japanese do so. Now, that is indeed a statistical disparity. But matter of fact, Japanese, they wait until the median age for Japanese marrying is somewhere around 30, 31 years old. Now, given that statistical disparity, and I don't know whether anybody can say that it's caused by discrimination, but it can lead to some other observed differences. That is, there's surely different income implications from one marrying when he's 30 than one marrying when he's a teenager. There are different income implications, both for that individual and for his children.
Now, if you really want to dig into some of the data, I believe it's Dr. Soul and I don't remember exactly where, in which book, which article, whatnot, but I believe he's the one that goes through and he kind of expands upon this idea of income differences based on group differences. So he points out that there are certain demographics where if you look at the median age or you look at the average age, the ages for some groups are higher than they are for other groups. And I don't remember exactly which ones, but what he points out, he says, look, if you have one race of people who happen to be on average older than another group of people, well, older people tend to have more money. So it would make sense that you would see a disparity between the two. Now you'll have to go look it up because unfortunately that's not something that I had time to pull up, but it is out there and you can go and look that same information up. Just as Dr. Williams said right here, he said, look, there are implications for marrying when you're older versus marrying when you're younger, right? When I've been married twice, so let's just put this out there. When I first married, I was in my mid-20s. I did not have the wealth that I have now. So if you had measured me then as a family, my wife and I, we had less wealth than my wife today and I, who married when we were in our 30s. And this is a certain reality. Like most everybody, when you're in your 30s, you have more wealth than you did when you were in your 20s. So if you marry earlier, then yes, household income will be lower. Let's continue.
Let me throw out another one. In the United States, 75% of all professional basketball players are Black, and the highest paid ones are Black. Now, surely that is a statistical disparity. That is, Blacks are not 75% of the United States population. There are 12% of the United States population, but 75% of basketball players. Can one say that that's caused by discrimination? Or can one say that Black basketball players are involved in some kind of conspiracy against white basketball players? Not to mention Japanese basketball players and women basketball players. In baseball, 3 out of the 5 highest home run hitters were black. The 10 highest slugging averages in a season, 7 were German Americans. The 5 times that more than 100 bases were stolen in the season, all of them were by blacks. You could go on and on. You could look at other differences between people in the United States and perhaps around the world. Look at age differences. In the United States, the median age of all Americans is 30 years old. The median age of Russian Orthodox Jews is 45 years old. Polish Americans, 40 years old. Japanese Americans, 34 years old. Black Americans, 22 years old. Mexican Americans, 16 years old. The median age, for those of you who have forgotten your statistics, median is half above, half below. Now, can one trace those age differences, those rather fantastic age differences, to racial discrimination? They're statistical differences. Would one expect that all ages should be the same? Now, furthermore, there are also other socioeconomic implications of these differences. That is, if you compare one group, most of whose members are teenagers, against another group, most of whose members are mid-career adults, would you be surprised to find significant differences in income at the median? You shouldn't be surprised at all, because you're comparing teenagers with mid-career adults many times. So the fact that there are significant income differences at the median for many Americans, a lot of people say that this is racial discrimination. But a lot of it represents things other than race. It represents age, at least in that case.
Okay. So he kind of goes into what I was talking about. He's like, look, you've got these differences in ages in groups, and he gives some of the specific numbers. But like I said, Thomas Sowell goes into it a little bit more in depth, and maybe it was Williams. Sometimes I think that one is saying something and it really was the other. But you can look them up and you can find this information. And there is a certain reality here that we're ignoring when we look at income gaps. But like I said, we still need to figure out whether there's systemic racism or not. Because at the end of the day, as we saw, where is that here? As we saw, there is 77% approval rate for whites, 69% for Asians, which I found a little interesting, 64% for Native American, 56% for Latino, and 48% Black. So does this represent some sort of systemic racism because of the gap, 77% down to 48%? Well, first and foremost, if you were to look at families and you were to identify 2-parent homes versus 1-parent homes, you're going to see statistical differences. If you look at the median age of people, then you're going to find another statistical difference. And according to Williams and Sowell, these things play a role in wealth, if nothing else. And wealth, of course, plays a role, just one role, in whether or not you're denied or approved for a loan, right? Like they're looking, because again, remember, banks want to make money. They want to make money off of you. So the question is, can they make money off you? If they can, because remember, everybody likes to say big banks and all these companies are so greedy, but somehow all of a sudden their greed is set aside so they can be racist. Well, let's take a look at some other charts and some other information. So let's see what I was able to dig up. Now, first and foremost, what I want to show you here is I want to show you a couple charts just kind of following Walter Williams here, where he shows that and I can't see it now. Let me see if I can pull it up so that I can see it on the screen here myself. So it shows one, and it's a little harder to see because I've got my logo in the way, folks. But the chart on the left is showing the diversity that is in NHL, and we can see that. Goodness, why am I? Let's do this so I can see it a little bit better. There we go, perfect. So I can see it now. So we see that the NBA the number of players that are white in the NBA is less than 25%, but in the NHL, it's darn near 100%. Like, that's great. Like, is that some sort of disparity? But then we look over to the right and we see the share of African Americans in the National Basketball Association, the NBA, and this is in 2023 now. Players represent 70.4%. Now, everybody likes to focus on, like, who are the coaches, or who are the presidents, the CEOs, and they'll say, well, only 7.9% or only 3.3% are team governors. But what they're forgetting to point out is that when it comes to the players, 70.4% are Black, which means less than 30% are some other demographic, right? And that is a disparity. It's a disparity in both directions. And we're seeing, what we're probably seeing here is largely choices, right? If Let's be colloquial about this. You go out to the nearest basketball court. Do you see a bunch of Asians and white guys playing basketball? No, you don't. It's not a problem. You just don't see it, right? Because people make different choices. Groups can make different choices. And it's not a problem. It's not that they all collectively got together and said, all right, we're all basketball players or we're all hockey players. It just happens to be that in certain groups, certain things are more common, plain and simple. It's not that difficult. But let's look at a couple of other charts that I've got. Or, yeah, a couple. Let's look at the CNN chart here. So here is the original one. So this comes from the same CNN article from which the chart that Brian Krassenstein showed. Okay. And so what this shows, and I'm going to make this a little bit, there we go, so I can see it. So what this shows is Black applicants had lower approval rates than those of other racial groups at every income level. So this is that CNN article. Navy Federal Credit Union's loan approval rates for Black in yellow, Latino in green, Asian in blue, and white in purple. Applicants by income in 2022. And I'm kind of in the way here, but let's see if we can move over just a little. So you can kind of see right down by my arm there. If I can move over just out of the way, it's showing 61K or less is the chart behind me. And then you move to 62 to 94K, and then 95 to 139K, and then 140K and more. So these are the income rates, or I'm sorry, groups that they've chosen to use. And so you can see that CNN has pointed out, and they said, look, white applicants with the lowest incomes were approved, and it's like right up above here, right there. So if you look up here, white applicants with the lowest incomes, and then you move over to the right, were approved at a slightly higher rate than Black applicants with the highest income. So they're kind of illustrating and saying, like, look, more poorer white people were approved percentage wise than wealthier Black applicants. Now, I don't have any answer for that, okay? Because it would require looking more into the data, which Navy Federal has declined to present. Doesn't mean anything necessarily, they've just declined to present it. But we can find some interesting things still from this chart, this very same chart. So let's take a look, and I want to show you, I want to highlight something else. So I want you to look at the first group and the last group here. Okay. And this shows we want to look at the Black and white gap here. So the Black and white gap in the lowest income bracket, lowest income range, is roughly, you see that the yellow there right above my head is roughly around 30%. And then the purple, white applicants, is roughly at about 60%. So there is a 30-point gap between Black and white applicants in the lowest income bracket. But when you look at the highest one, that gap actually is reduced. So now you've got the approval rate of Black applicants at roughly around 60%, and then white applicants just over 80. So we'll maybe call it 85%. So we go from a 30-point difference down to roughly a 25-point difference, right? And you can see that it shrinks as it goes. It doesn't shrink a whole lot, but it does shrink. All right. So that's one. So now let's take a look at the next bit of information that we can learn from the very same chart. All right. So we look over here, and I've drawn some lines. And what these lines show is the that pardon me, I'm a little okay. Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. Okay, so what these lines show is that all groups rose from the lowest income group to the highest income group. So you can see here, like right above my head, we the black applicants are at about 30%. But then you look over to the next income group and you can see that they're more about 45%. And then you look over and you can see that they're getting close to 60%. And then they get to about 60% at 140K. But you see the same things for Latino and Asian and white. Every single group has rose in their percentages of approval rates as their income rose. Now, remember what I said. The idea of loaning money is to make money, right? You're not doing it out of your goodwill, that's for sure. They want to make money. And what we're seeing here in CNN's own chart is that there seems to be a correlation with income and percentage rates of those who were approved. Now, again, we haven't identified, what is the cause necessarily for the disparity, because there is a disparity in every single income group. But we do notice that the disparity actually starts to decrease. So we start with a 30-point difference in the lowest income group, and then we go to about a 25-point difference. So it's reduced by about 5 percentage points by the time we get to 140K or more. So this kind of suggests that income plays a role. And it also suggests that banks, or at least Navy Federal, may actually be interested in um, giving loans to different people, to different groups of people, because the rates keep going up with every group, with every single group. And then let's take a look at this last bit of information, which I think is very interesting. So we're going to look at just the black rates, and maybe I'll move myself a little bit here, out of the way here, so we can do this. All right. So how about this? Now let's take a look at one more thing that we can identify from this one chart. And again, it's from CNN. So we look at the black rates over here. Try to point here. So over to the right, or my right at least. So we look at the rates of which is about 30% and the 61K or less. Then we look at 140K. We look at the approval rates. They're at about 60%. They doubled. The rates of the black applicant approval rate doubled from those who were making $61,000 or less to those who were making $140,000 or less, or more. And they doubled. But if you look at the other groups, no other group had such a significant increase. So if you look at the Hispanics did not almost double, because Hispanics were getting close to 40. So they're probably about 35, and they're just above 60. So they didn't double. Asian, they didn't double. They were about 40. Well, okay. So it looks like actually Asians did double as well. But what we don't see is that the whites don't double, right? So the larger jump with income came out of actually blacks. And now that I'm looking at it a second time, Asians as well. Whereas with the whites, with white applicants, we had 60%, and they only were able to rise to about roughly, if I'm guessing here, another 25 percentage points. So they didn't double for sure, because if they had doubled, they'd be over 100%, which wouldn't even be possible. So what does all this mean? What I'm saying here is I think that when you look at this data, you don't immediately see this knee-jerk reaction that, yeah, it must be systemic racism. I think, and when we hear from economists who say, hey, there's a lot of implications based on, family makeup, and and all these other factors that play a role, age, then it starts to question whether or not we should even first be looking at systemic racism as a problem. Because the biggest question that I would have is, if there is systemic racism, why does it seem that when incomes rise, we see a rise in those percentages. Why do we see that? Or maybe a better question to ask could be, why is it that I'm trying to think of how to formulate my question, which is kind of off the cuff. But when we're looking at this data and we're trying to suggest that it's systemic racism, then we have to start answering, why did certain blacks get chosen over other ones, right? So we saw the story of the gentleman, I can't remember his name, a few moments ago in that CNN article, and it sounded like, for what was presented, that he was a good candidate. I don't know. I don't know his full history. I don't know exactly what Navy Federal is looking at. Um, and it's possible that maybe the person just looked at him and said, "Nah, you're black. I don't really want to loan to you." I mean, it's possible, right? It's always possible that there are onesies and twosies around here. But the question is whether it's systemic. And when I look at this data, I'm not seeing systemic, because I'm seeing changes that go along with what economists say. When economists say, hey, if you have a two-parent home, then your outcomes for income are better. When you have better income, then you have more access to wealth, or opportunities, and your wealth increases. Certain demographics happen to be older, and some of them are younger. Older folk simply have more wealth. When you have more wealth, again, you have more opportunity. So when I look at their own data, I'm not really seeing anything other than, hey, there's some disparities here. But as Walter Williams pointed out, just because there's a disparity doesn't mean it's a result of racism. And when people want to ask these questions like, what else could it be? They never ask, hey, is there racism in the NBA? Why is it that there aren't very many Asian basketball players? Why aren't there very many white basketball players? Nobody ever seems to apply the same reasoning, the same logic in other areas where the imbalance seems to favor a group, right? And in this particular case, the Black community. It favors the Black community to be the majority, the greater majority of NBA players. But because it favors them, that question all of a sudden seems to no longer be pertinent. And if we're going to insist that statistical differences must be reduced in order to show that there's equality in society, then we need to be consistent and do it all around. But they're not. They all People like the Krassensteins only do it when it comes to Black and Latino homes. I have yet to see somebody along that says, "Hey, I don't like this disparity with Black incomes." Then turn around and go, "You know what? I don't like this disparity in the NHL or the NBA or the NFL or other places." I said NHL, but I meant just NBA and NFL, where uh, Black individuals are more dominant. They don't ever ask those questions there, and I think the reason is clear: they're race baiting. And I don't think they're actually looking at all the data and saying, here's what's going on. This is this is why I had that quote at the very beginning. If you cannot achieve equality of performance among people born to the same parents and raised under the same roof, how realistic is it to expect it to achieve it across broader and deeper social divisions? I want you to think about that for just a moment before we close. I want you to think about, how many times have you heard about a brother and a sister, or brother and brother, just siblings, and one is doing very well and the other one is not? Happens all the time. It's the disparity between me and my siblings is significant in some ways. And but we were raised under the same roof. We were raised with the same parents. We were raised with the same rules. I got in more trouble, actually. Um, so when we look at the differences, we can't just immediately knee jerk and say it must be a negative social thing, because society is complex and we need to account for that. And we might want to look further in history and say, do we see some of these same things earlier on, before we started doing all these things to help different groups? And the answer to that is no, we don't see those things. We actually, I mean, if you look at the data, you're going to find that prior to 1970, things weren't peachy. Don't get me wrong. We're not saying things are peachy. But what we are saying is that there was a rise that already was in existence. And there were certain things that were actually better. Two-parent homes among the Black community were much higher prior to the 1970s. But after the 1970s, it took a nosedive. And economists are saying, hey, your family life contributes a whole lot to your outcome in later life. And if that's the case, then the problem is a whole lot less racism. All right, folks, I appreciate you tuning in. And again, sorry I was so late, but I do hope that you found this episode informative and inspiring. I want you to be sure to catch me every Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. You know what? Let me take a look here. No, I don't see any comments. I don't have to address any comments. We'll just keep going with the close. All right. And then again, join me on Sundays at 7 p.m. with my co-host, Susan Hogarth, where we discuss LP happenings. We look across the vastness of tyranny that is in this country, and we find out what is going on in the Libertarian Party. Are there events that people can attend? Are there things that you can be excited about? Are there things happening with the Libertarian Party, which, by the way, is the third largest political party in the United States? And I may be a little on the biased side, but I think the best party suited and to protect your liberties. And it turns out there's actually a lot to report on. Now, make sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel at youtube.libertydad.com. You can also subscribe to Rumble, my Rumble channel at rumble.libertydad.com. Let me know how I'm doing. Leave a note in the leave a comment. Leave me a comment to read. Let me know. Maybe you disagreed with something. Maybe I left something out, right? Like, feel free to let me know. And lastly, I want you to remember that if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. And until next time, I'm going to, I messed that up. Catch you next time. But until then, I am out. Thank you.